When we think of world wars, we usually think of men manning machine guns, artillery, tanks, fighters, bombers, U-boats, and battleships. Yet behind those machines were men and women in factories, mines, and very often completely unmentioned farms that provided their part to keep the war running. This meant ultimately it came down to allocating a limited amount of manpower. This was central in both world wars, and balancing the productive force with the fighting force was crucial. The limits and fragility of economic mobilization for an industrialized war at the grand scale became most apparent shortly after the beginning of the First World War. The Western Front in 1914 to 1918 represented the largest number of men who had ever faced off in a wartime situation. At the same time, these millions of men were no longer employed in the home nation's workforces in a productive capacity. Rather, they now filled inherently unproductive roles and had to be supported. This was also a major issue during World War II, so let's explore the fragile interdependence of strategic resources, industrial production, food, and manpower in both world wars. The inherent disbalance between production and soldiers in the field became apparent once the First World War wasn't over after a few weeks as originally envisioned. Thus, the principal belligerents soon encountered the fundamental problem of economics, the allocation of scarce resources between alternative uses. In other words, there were too many men in the trenches. To give you just one example, from the British coal mining industry, about 250,000 men joined the army in the first year of the war. This was about 20% of the total workforce. Now, your relationship with coal might be rather distant, but in those days coal was a key resource in many aspects. Even during the Second World War, it was still the key fuel. Coal was the main energy source of industrialized societies, the key fuel for transport on land and sea, industry, electricity and gas generation, the making of iron and steel, and domestic heating. So imagine 20% less workforce in an industry that provided fuel for trains, ships, and the armament industry had a rather significant impact, once the war to end all wars didn't end after a few weeks. Hence, the British authorities now attempted to dissuade miners from volunteering. The situation in World War II was similar. Although Germany had plenty of coal, the major bottleneck was the manpower breaking it out of the earth. The mines and machines weren't properly modernized, and since the war effort required the resources to be spent somewhere else, the only way production could be increased was by doing shifts on Sundays, the use of slave labor, and prisoners of war. Nevertheless, the production was insufficient. Thus, coal for civilian use was limited after 1941. Now, since manpower was such a major issue, let's look at some ways to circumvent the lack of manpower. Probably the most direct way was just to recall men from the front line. In France, industrialists themselves were even empowered to recall men from the frontline units, and by the end of 1915, against the protest of generals, about 500,000 former soldiers had been brought back to the French munitions industry. To give you some numbers for Germany, in mid-1916, almost 1.2 million men had been sent from the front back into the factories. By mid-1918, the number had reached more than 2.4 million men. In the Second World War, the Germans tried another variation. After the fall of France in summer 1940, the Germans sent many of their soldiers, especially metal workers, on vacation from the military duties in order to work in the arms industry. Yet the impact on the total numbers was limited and of course prevented these men from further training. Another way was to requisition workers from somewhere else, where somewhere else could be colonies, other countries, or prisoners of war camps. And for the First World War, there's a clear difference between French and German numbers. For France, in 1917, about 40,000 prisoners of war worked in French factories. In 1918, France employed 108,000 foreign workers and 61,000 colonial workers. In contrast, during 1917, Germany employed 250,000 foreign workers, and this number grew to 306,000 in 1918. Additionally, in 1917, more than 390,000 prisoners of war worked in German factories. Besides men, there were also women. The real reserve of labor, however, consists of the female population. In all countries, industrial development in the manufacture of weapons and munitions depended on the mass employment of women. As an example, for Germany in 1917, more than 4 million women worked in the war industry, which is about 16 times the number of foreign workers or around 10 times the number of prisoners of war employed. Of course, women in factories wasn't something particularly novel, yet before the war they worked usually in the textile industry, not in the armaments industry. Manpower is also affected by losses. Now I won't talk about battlefield losses in this video, since I stumbled across a particular interesting aspect of losses, namely the losses from accidents in factories. You may think this number might not be particularly high, but we have the number for the United States in the Second World War, and it is quite substantial. Between 1941 and 1945, 86,000 died in industrial accidents, just under 1/4 of those who died in combat. About 100,000 workers per year suffered permanent partial disabilities, which amounted to roughly 500,000 industrial casualties by the end of World War, relative to 671,000 soldier casualties. Just over 2 million per year suffered temporary disabilities in factories. And note, this was for the United States, which wasn't bombed, was well fed, and had very modern production facilities. So we can assume the losses for other countries were probably high in relative numbers or maybe even in absolute numbers. Now let's look at food, which often gets ignored besides the occasional army walks on its stomach quote. In both world wars, every faction's food supply had to compete with everything else on several levels. Core resources of peasant farmers such as manpower, livestock, fertilizer and machinery were either reallocated to the military or were no longer available, most often due to import restrictions. This situation was very similar in the Second World War. Mechanization in order to compensate was difficult because the production of agricultural machinery declined precipitously as industrial plants switched to making tanks and arms. Fuel shortages and lack of spare parts often prevented the proper use of those machines that were available. But it didn't end with the allocation of production resources and machinery. One major aspect was transportation, be it ship, train or horse cart. Civilian food supplies had to compete with coal and fuel, steel, phosphates for explosives, military supplies and troops for limited shipping space. Additionally, you need to keep in mind that working hours during the war increased and the labor was more intensive, thus the demand for proper nutrition increased as well, not to mention the calories required by soldiers fighting in the fields. Which brings us to the impact of the food or its lack on the battlefield. The majority of Japanese troops chose to starve to death rather than surrender. Estimates suggest that 60%, more than 1 million, of the total of 1.7 million Japanese military deaths between 1941 and 1945 were caused by starvation and diseases associated with malnutrition. Naturally, in 1945, the US War Food Administration stated that food is a weapon of war. As such, it ranks with ships, airplanes, tanks, and guns. Of course, food and hunger can be quite relative. The level of hunger in the Soviet Union made a mockery of the argument propounded by the pre-war British and German governments that an adequate food supply was a cornerstone of success in the circumstances of total war. Now you also need to remember that in both world wars, a large amount of the workforce was still working in the agriculture sector, which nowadays is a very small workforce in the same countries. Here are some numbers around the First World War. Germany's agricultural sector was around 35% in 1913. This includes farming and forestry. For France in 1911 it was 44% working in farming. For the United Kingdom the number was quite low, for around 10% of the workforce, but it was an exception and depended heavily on imports. Another major aspect to consider is of course organization. For France, the majority of farmers were working in small holdings with less than 25 acres or 0.1 square kilometer. This meant the mechanization or other optimization efforts were rather limited, even during peacetime. Another major problem with small holdings was that they were rather fragile in terms of workforce. The biggest blow to production was conscription, which deprived many of the small holdings of their only full-time worker. Accurate statistics are impossible to obtain, but the best estimate puts the overall decrease of the male farming workforce through the draft at 43%. Additionally, since in northern France some of the most fertile lands were located, the German occupation of these territories reduced French food production considerably. These are just a few examples on how organization, conscription, and occupation can have extensive effects on the system that is mostly stable during a short war or limited war. To summarize, as you can see in some aspects, the distinction between front and home front in total war gets very thin even without considering espionage or strategic bombing. Just the number of losses in US factories is quite staggering. Furthermore, the importance of proper organization and allocation of manpower, facilities, resources and transportation were central and could have a major influence. Even if resources like coal in Germany was largely available, if the potential for proper exploitation was limited, it was just a value on a piece of paper. Note that I intentionally focused on less commonly mentioned resources like coal and food, instead of referring to oil and iron, since those are usually the most talked about. Similarly, I skipped finance for now, something I will cover in the future, but as so often, the few numbers are a critical indicator. So if you like more videos with similar topics like this, consider sharing them. Another way is of course to support me on Patreon. Remember, every dollar helps, spending more time and resources into the production quality. Now if you're interested in some tactics, check out this video on German panzer tactics, or maybe you are more interested in a contemporary topic, like Russia's military power in 2017. As always, sources are in the description. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.